You know what? I don't feel like picking up milk today.
Hello, fellow nerds. Welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share the story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
I'm Elford Stephens. I'm a gameaholic.
I'm Phil Thomas, and I'm a relative video game newbie.
And I'm Andy Hunter. Been playing games for a while, but mostly just a Nintendo guy.
Today, we are going back to the Postal series and looking at Postal 2. Postal 2 is a 2003 open-world first-person shooter for the PC and Mac developed by our old friends Running with Scissors and published by Whiptail Interactive. As you can guess from the title, sequel to the original Postal, and as in the first game, you play as a dude who's very creatively called the Postal Dude as he makes his way through the town of Paradise, Arizona, with levels divided into days, Monday through Friday in the base game, and eventually Saturday and Sunday through a later expansion. The Postal Dude needs to complete a list of chores, such as buying milk, returning a library book, or cashing a paycheck. Along the way, the Postal Dude interacts with the locals of Paradise, including anti-video game protesters, trigger-happy police, and even Al-Qaeda, who place obstacles in his way, all the while hurling insults, derisive laughter, or gunfire at the dude. Facing increasingly challenging hurdles just to make it through each day, it's up to the player to decide how much the Postal Dude is willing to put up with. Will he grin and bear it, or will he give in to his rage and just go postal? If you decide to get violent, the Postal Dude has an array of weapons, including shovels, assault rifles, and napalm to assist in his murderous rampage. The game also offers clever innovations, like a dedicated button for pissing on people and shoving your gun up a cat's ass to use as a silencer.
It's easy to mock it, but I never have heard of using a cat butt as a silencer before in a video games. I don't think it's a stretch to call that an innovation.
I mean, that is a stretch.
Hi-yo.
Dear God. I'm already
Just saying.
embarrassed with us. I usually do a back-of-the-box description here, but Postal 2's box is not terribly exciting. It's just a bulleted list of features. For example, it boasted Postal 2 had, quote, humor with absurd, over-the-top violent content, and quote, a psychological thriller with a punchline ending, end quote. Other listed features included a non-linear open world, NPCs you can interact with, thank God, because no game has ever had that before, and the ability to play as the Postal Dude, which, I mean, up to that point, only one game let you do that, so I guess that's pretty special. All kidding aside, while Postal 2 marketed itself as a violent video game, it also promised an experience where the player could decide exactly how violent they wanted their experience to be. Quote, Postal 2 is only as violent as you are. You can be a pacifist or an ultra-violent dude, end quote. However, the game box did caution, quote, if you choose to play as a pacifist, you'll still have to deal with the NPCs, who may also go postal, end quote. So today, we're going to examine Postal 2, its development, its reception, as well as the fortunes of its creators Running with Scissors. And I'll present my case for why I think this might actually be the earliest MAGA video game. If you'd like a detailed rundown of the early years of Running with Scissors and their first game, go ahead and check out our episode on the original Postal. But here's the short version. Running with Scissors was founded in 1996 as an offshoot of RSP Inc., which was a work-for-hire game development company run by Mike Riddell and Vincent J. Desiderio Jr., aka Vince Desi. The first original title for Running with Scissors was Postal, which was an isometric shooter released for the PC in 1997, where your goal was to go on a mass shooting spree through the town of Paradise, Arizona. On the back of an aggressive, controversy-based marketing campaign, the game attracted denunciations from the likes of the United States Postal Service and U.S. Senator Joseph Lieberman. It ended up getting dropped by major retailers, as well as its publisher Ripcord Games, on its way to mixed reviews and very, very modest sales. However, were you to ask Running with Scissors head Vince Desi, he would paint a significantly rosier picture of Postal's fortunes. To hear him tell it, the game had been an overwhelming success, selling hundreds of thousands of copies, and the self-described envelope-shredding letter bomb of a game had been a phenomenon so extreme it had been, in his words, blacklisted in the United States. As for losing its publisher, well, that wasn't lackluster sales, no siree. That was because Howard Stern read the wrong ad copy on his show and scared off Panasonic Ripcord's parent company, away from being associated with the most extreme game ever made. And again, for more on all of that, check out our Postal episode. In early 1998, Running with Scissors released Special Delivery, a Postal expansion that added 4 new levels and a co-op feature. And then for a while, nothing happened. Running with Scissors apparently willing to just let that money roll in from a game that had been dropped by most major American retailers. Fast forward to the end of 2001, and a controversial game with over-the-top humor and violence was taking the gaming world by storm. Oh, no. It wasn't a Running with Scissors game. It was Grand Theft Auto 3. Developed by DMA Design and published by Rockstar Games, Grand Theft Auto 3 for the PlayStation 2 transformed the traditionally top-down series into a sprawling 3D city where players took on the role of a low-level thug working his way through the criminal underworld of Liberty City. It was a huge leap forward both of the series and gaming, attracting mainstream attention on its way to becoming a commercial and critical success. Grand Theft Auto 3 sold nearly 2 million copies in 2001 alone, and at one point it was the second best-selling piece of software in the United States, behind only Norton Antivirus 2002.
Wow.
To say Grand Theft Auto 3 was influential in video game design in the early 21st century is a massive understatement, and many developers adopted different elements from it. These included the rise of the open world sandbox genre, games that tackled more complex stories or pushed the boundaries of violence, profanity, and sex, and some games that just straight up tried to attract controversy for easy public attention and quick sales. I'm looking at you, Acclaim, with BMX XXX, which will be a future episode. Regardless of how they approached it, in the years to come, numerous other game companies tried to jump on the GTA bandwagon, borrowing elements popularized by Grand Theft Auto 3 in hopes of replicating its success. And one of those companies paying close attention to Grand Theft Auto 3 was Running with Scissors, who were inexplicably still in business despite not releasing anything since Special Delivery in 1998. How the small independent firm managed to remain in operation despite not making anything in 4 years or releasing anything in 3 years is a mystery to me, and whether Vince Desi had a deceased wealthy relative who left him a huge inheritance, or he had held a foreign royal for ransom, or slipped in a Manhattan bagel and collected a huge settlement, we'll never know. Nevertheless, Running with Scissors saw GTA 3 as justification to finally get back into the game-making business. On February the 5th, 2002, Running with Scissors officially announced a Postal sequel. In it, the company declared, quote, "Today, the most dangerous video game development company on the planet, Running with Scissors, announced Postal 2 is coming for real." Vince Desi promised the new game would cause more trouble for the establishment than its predecessor, exclaiming, quote, "The spineless bastards who pretend to represent the interests of the non-game-playing public are going to shit themselves when they see this," end quote. Now, design-wise, Grand Theft Auto 3's inspiration for Postal 2 is pretty obvious. For one, like Grand Theft Auto, Postal 2 replaced the original's top-down isometric perspective with an open world, turning Paradise, Arizona into an explorable 3D world where the Postal dude could interact with the various colorful characters that lived in Paradise, and possibly decapitate them with a shovel. Postal 2 also ramped up the violence, replacing the bog-standard shooting of the original Postal with a more cartoonish, over-the-top approach. The game gave players the freedom to just lay waste to everyone they meet, beat them to death with protest signs, throw diseased cow heads at them, douse them in gasoline and light them on fire, and piss on people until they vomited thanks to a dedicated peeing button, or shove a gun up a cat's ass as a silencer and pump everyone full of lead. On the other hand, like I mentioned at the outset, Running with Scissors added an interesting twist. The game left it up to the player to decide when and if they wanted to start shooting, and its missions put players in a position where they could choose whether to complete an objective peacefully or violently. For example, stand in line at the bank and wait to cash that check, or mow down everyone in front of you, grab the money from the vault, and run for the cops. The choice, Running with Scissors claimed, was up to the player. So that theoretically, a player could make it through the entire game without killing anyone, although I'll talk about how well they executed that in a little bit. As their slogan explained, quote, "It's only as violent as you are." Thoughts so far?
I have a question. So there's a dedicated pee button and you can use a cat as a silencer. Is the cat then allowed to pee on you? Because I think that's only fair.
Speaking for cats' rights advocates.
Yeah. What's got into that cat? Postal dude's gun.
Oh, dear God.
God.
I just have one thing to say about the supposed mission statement that you as the player could choose whether to be violent or not. I am personally dubious that their design chop were right up there with like the folks who made Deus Ex in terms of you can really like the path that you want to go down, but I'm ready to be surprised.
I've been thinking similar. I'm curious. How did they accomplish this?
They also tried to lift some of Grand Theft Auto 3's satirical humor. Because you see, with the Postal sequel, the guys at Running with Scissors clearly decided that one thing that the first Postal game was missing was jokes. And the team set out to make Postal 2 an over-the-top satire that would leave the player holding their sides with clever, incisive humor, poking fun at the foibles of modern American society. As Vince Desi later explained in a 2007 interview with Brendan Sinclair of GameSpot, quote, "Our design policy is really very simple. When we consider content, we first ask ourselves, is this fun to play? And second, is it funny? We never think in terms of violence. It reduces the game to a one-dimensional perspective, aka boring. We design for laughs. It's so much more entertaining when you can play for fun and at the same time laugh your ass off," end quote. Now, I will say I am no comedy expert, and no sane person would accuse me of being intentionally funny, but I think it's really interesting to see people's comedic inspirations. And playing through Postal 2, you can definitely see some of the elements that influence Running with Scissors' style of humor. For one, they clearly spent a lot of time mainlining the first couple of seasons of South Park and pre-cancellation Family Guy, as they definitely wanted Postal 2 to be the rudest, crudest game ever created, chock full of swearing and bathroom humor, sprinkled with a bunch of absurdist, lol, so random moments. Take the Postal dude's dialogue as an example. Practically every other word he says is shit, or you gotta be fucking kidding me. You can also hit a button, unzip your fly, and pee on people. Speaking of the lol random category, one section has you running around in a gimp suit while everyone laughs at you. You can get a quick health boost by smoking crack. And overall, playing through this game, I kind of get in terms of humor where they were going for. In my opinion, a lot of its delivery comes off as forced and lazy. Less South Park and more tripping the riff. Kids, ask your parents. Another set of inspiration that really shines through is the routines of 90s stand-up comedians and late-night hosts, because Postal 2 is packed to the brim with dated humor, even for the early 2000s. For example, the game has a drawn-out set of jokes about the 2000 presidential election, including a hanging Chad reference, kids, ask your parents. It has references to the Psychic Friends Network, kids, ask your grandparents for that one, and even one whole section that's an extended parody of the 1993 Waco siege. Dude, look it up. I don't have time to explain. It's so egregious. I'm honestly shocked that they didn't include a joke about airline food or the DMV.
I run out of space on the floppy disk.
Some of their jokes also come off as the Kirkland brand equivalent of Grand Theft Auto 3 jokes. For example, like GTA, Postal 2 has off-the-wall signage all over Paradise. However, Live It, in my opinion, comes off just as lazy and low as common denominator. For example, the local bank is called Fee of America. Get it? There are shipping containers all over the place that should say ball sacks on them, because that's a funny word to say. The local Chinese restaurant is called Cock Asian. Flyers advertise for Father Touchy's after-school boys club, and a headstone in the town graveyard just says rape clowns. Oh,
You gotta be fucking kidding me.
Oh, and speaking of rape jokes, did I mention the racism, sexism, and homophobia? Because in pursuit of maximum laughs, Running with Scissors also put in a lot of that. Early in the game, you encounter a convenience store clerk who is literally just a straight up ripoff of Apu from The Simpsons, complete with telling customers to come again. There is also a sight gag where you see a character in a turban perusing the bomb guides and terrorist handbook section of the Paradise Library. One place in town is just called the Ghetto Licka Brewery because urban slang is really funny when white people write it. The Postal dude runs errands for his nagging wife, describing the game simply as the bitch, and later expansions depict her as a fat monster. And in one of the more blatant bids for shock-based attention, if you visit the local video arcade, you can play a game called Gay Slur Hunter, where you have to kill as many gay people as possible.
Oh, jeez.
So yeah, Running with Scissors wants you to know that they're a company with the balls to tell the real jokes the PC police won't let you say. As the February 5th, 2002 press release snarkily explained, Postal 2 was going to be a, quote, politically corrected game about the most boring subject that we could think of, a guy going to buy milk, end quote. So yeah, this is what we're working with here. a little bit about the design here. Let's see who wants to back this game. Because in February of 2003, Running with Scissors secured a publisher in Whiptail Interactive. Founded in 2003 and based in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Postal 2 was Whiptail's first title. However, Whiptail Interactive was definitely a step down from Postal 1 publisher Ripcord Games. In terms of distribution, Whiptail only managed to get Postal 2 on the shelves at GameStop and EB Games. The company also lacked Ripcord's Panasonic-based marketing budget, forcing Running with Scissors to rely on some more creative, low-cost methods to promote their new game. For example, Running with Scissors managed to get a celebrity spokesman. In a bid for lull random marketing, they hired former Different Strokes star Gary Coleman.
Nice.
In addition to portraying himself in the game, Coleman also made appearances at promotional events and gaming conventions. When asked why they chose Coleman, Desi later explained in a 2004 Electronic Gaming Business Report, quote, "He's the symbol of everything that has gone wrong with America," end quote. I imagine
I'm curious as to what he meant by that.
I wish the person who wrote this article had pressed him a little bit more on context, because that's literally all he says about it.
If I found somebody to be everything that's wrong with America, I wouldn't hire them to promote my company unless I was trying to troll that person individually as well, which is, kind of a bully mentality. Either way, what are these people thinking? That's my question. Who thinks like this? Who behaves like this? As a converse, I don't like Ted Nugent's views, and I think what Jenny McCarthy does as a prominent anti-vaxxer is dangerous. I might advocate that what they're doing is something that's wrong in America today, but I would never hire those people to promote my company because I want to give them another platform to promulgate their views. So the only thing I could take away from him saying that Gary Coleman is what's wrong with America today is that he's black, and this person just doesn't like black people. So that's the only thing I could take from this.
I could totally see that. I really could.
I don't really know what it is. Obviously, there's a joke there that I don't see. A lot of us know who he is, and he's very small, and he had the cute way he behaved on the show. And so I could see the shock value of having him around. But so maybe so many things in politics, there's a code here that I don't know, that Gary Coleman represents all that's wrong with this country. And maybe that's something that people who they're speaking towards know that I just don't know.
Yeah, I think you guys both might be onto something. The closest thing I can come to maybe a legitimate reason is that he's somebody who in theory should be rich, but due to circumstances, which I think in Coleman's case were largely not within his control, he is not rich, and thus somehow failure of modern America to live up to its ideals or something.
And I've got to think that some of that is because at that point, Gary Coleman was mostly getting, I think, public attention on sort of postmodern 80s nostalgia. On the one hand, I imagine Coleman was not terribly expensive in 2002. And I imagine they're trying to bank on it's so random. Gary Coleman from Different Strokes in our game. That's going to get people to sign up for our game where, we can kill gay people in this little arcade game we made. Also, the company adopted the old adage of sex sells, introducing a marketing tactic they called the Postal Babes. The Postal Babes were conventionally attractive women in skimpy Postal branded outfits who would appear at Running with Scissors' sponsored events. So congrats, Running with Scissors. You successfully invented the booth babe. Way to go. So while the company couldn't afford a booth at E3, they could have Gary Coleman walk around the convention flanked by a pair of Postal babes who threw Postal branded thongs at attendees, riding less of a wave and more of a budget constrained ripple of hype. Postal 2 released a limited retail release on April the 14th, 2003. And so what do we think the critical and the fan reception is to this game? I'm seeing Phil with the 2 thumbs down.
Considering I never heard of Postal before you brought it up, I'm thinking it did poorly.
Yeah, I was about to ask, did it even make enough of a splash that many critics bothered to review it?
It was reviewed a lot. I want to say in part because of the infamy of its predecessor. So it did get a lot of critical reception, and not much of it was good. The same reviews were mixed in the so-called, quote, single most controversial and highly anticipated sequel in the history of video games, to quote from a April 10, 2003 Running with Scissors press release, would be an understatement as critics gave Postal 2 middling to poor reviews across the board. Most pointed out the game's lackluster combat, poorly designed AI, bad hit detection, and intolerably long load times. Even those who felt the game was fun felt it got old quickly. Much like the original Postal, the company's bold-faced attempt to attract controversy was not lost on critics. For example, Mark Saltzman of the Globe and Mail observed that aside from sparking controversy, Postal 2 had little going for it, saying, quote, Postal 2 will likely offend many groups for its disturbing content. Policemen and policewomen can be decapitated with a shovel. Some arcade games in town bear the name Gay Slur Hunter. Cats and dogs can be slaughtered on the streets. Middle Eastern men peruse bomb building and terrorism books at the library before opening fire with a machine gun, and the lead character can unzip his pants and urinate on just about anything, including protesters. But then again, it's this controversy and political incorrectness the developers want to be known for. Too bad for them, it's just not a good game, end quote. Eric Woolpaw of GameSpot, who gave Postal 2 a 4.8 out of 10, commented, quote, it's clear that Postal 2's developers attempted to make an outrageous game to get everyone's attention, but these days, even a game like this requires great gameplay to accompany its naked bid for infamy, something the game designers seem to have failed to realize, end quote. As for the game's attempt at humor, critical reception largely hinged on whether the reviewer was okay with bathroom humor and racist stereotypes. For example, George Smith at Game Rankings wrote a review that I feel tells me just as much about him as it does Postal 2, writing, quote, make no mistake about it, Postal 2 is the most offensive game to see release. There's something in Postal 2 that will offend just about every group of crybaby stereotypes or minorities, and the fact that I'm not offended by any of its content means I'm either an enigma or a psychopath, end quote. Others, however, called it juvenile and gross for its own sake. For example, Steve Boxer of The Guardian wrote, quote, Postal 2 clearly thinks it's chock full of black humor, but frankly, it makes such films as Dumb and Dumber look like the works of English playwright Noel Coward at his sharpest. Far too sick for under 18s, but only teenagers could possibly find it clever, end quote. Ivan Selleck of IGN gave the game 5.5 out of 10, noting, quote, Postal is ironically perfectly suited for 12-year-olds caught up in spending their days trying to get shots of Chun-Li kicking just right so her panties show. So you know, they're exactly the audience that shouldn't be playing this game. How any other gamer who has body hair and has been kicked in the head by a donkey could like this is beyond my comprehension, end quote. The harshest critics took aim at the game's racism, sexism, and homophobia. Tom Price of Gamer gave the game a 0 out of 10, calling Postal 2, quote, crass, disgusting, and hateful. Robert Coffey of Computer Gaming World also gave the game a 0, calling it, quote, a relentlessly idiotic, ill-conceived, hateful, humorless romp through an infected colon, end quote. Ending his review, quote, until someone boxes up syphilis and sells it as retail, Postal 2 is the worst product ever foisted upon consumers, end quote.
What a review.
I mean, yeah, if I were that critic, I would frame that clipping and put it on my wall.
Hold on to the thought of memorializing this, because it's going to come back. Reading through the GameFAQs user reviews from the time, fan reception was also pretty mixed. There were just as many 3 and 4 out of 10s as there were 9 out of 10s. Positives among users included the game's offensive humor, its open world design, and its peeing mechanics. Negatives included the game's offensive humor, super intelligent AI that can hit you even behind cover, and the game's abysmal loading times. Even people who love the game pointed this out. And in preparation for this episode, I subjected myself to Postal 2. Dude, this game hurt my soul, man. This is a hard one. Like I said before, the way the game is structured, the game doesn't have levels, it has days. And it plays through Monday through Friday. And each day is divided into a list of tasks. It's usually between 3 and 4 tasks you have to do each day. I made it through Wednesday, and then I gave up. So I went through about 3/5 of this game. So I can say that while I didn't finish the game, I feel like I played enough of it to formulate an opinion about it, number one. Number two, based on Steam achievement percentages, that puts me ahead, I think, about 60% of players who've played Postal 2 on Steam. This is definitely one of the worst games I've played in a while. Aside from all the racism and all the other shit they put in this game, the big thing I would describe about the experience of this game is traipsing. I would argue this might be the first ever walking simulator, because literally every objective has you go from like one far end of this map to the other far end of this map. And the way they tried to make this big open world is they tried to make it so that the open world is effectively divided into sections. I'm not a developer, but my understanding that's not uncommon is each section of the game and then you cordon it off with loading. And most games will try to make it so they hide the loading some way so you don't see the transition between the different sections of the game. They didn't try that. This is what they do instead. The loading sections are separated by literal tunnels that warn you that a loading screen is ahead. Anywhere you go in the game, you've got to go through like 3 or 4 of these loading screens. And every objective is always like, you're on one far end of the map and you got to go to the other. The level is also not well organized. Of all the things they ripped off of Grand Theft Auto 3, I wish they ripped off the mini map in the corner of the screen, because instead they have a map screen, which is not well laid out. So have fun checking that map every 6 goddamn seconds like I did. It also doesn't help. The game's missions are so formulaic and so repetitive. Every mission in this game, especially in those early days, effectively present you with basically the same scenario. Go from one end of the map to your objective, which is usually on the absolute other end of the map. Navigate maybe 3 or 4 of these long loading gaps to get there. Get to your objective and wait in line, literally waiting in a line of NPCs. So like one of your objectives is to cash a paycheck. You have to stand in line at the bank. One of them is to get milk. And you go to that racist convenience store and you stand in line to buy milk. So going in line and do the task. Inevitably, some group comes in and starts shooting, and you make your way out and onto the next task. Maybe you shoot people on the way if you feel like it. And so in that framework, it's less that the game offers player choice and more accurate to say the game presents the player the same 2 choices over and over and over again. When I go to cash my paycheck / buy milk / return library books / confess sins, do I open up an assault rifle and shoot people, or do I literally wait in this goddamn line? When the protesters / bank robbers / police / rednecks / terrorists start shooting, do I shoot back or do I run? And either way, take a whole lot of damage. And we'll talk about combat in a second. It's just so formulaic and so repetitive. Let's talk about that whole is only violent as you want it to be, that pacifist mode this game has. Running was just clearly, blatantly wants you to pick the violent option. They want you to shoot your way through this whole game. They want you to beat people with death with shovels. And to that end, like you mentioned Deus Ex, Andy, this game is not a Deus Ex, where the developers realize, okay, we're going to have multiple different play styles, and we're going to make all those play styles fun. It's like I played a lot of Deus Ex Human Revolution, and like you can play that game entirely on stealth, not fire a shot, and it's really fun and really interesting and really challenging. Or you can shoot your way through it, and that's fun too. This game is not Deus Ex, where they're trying to make the violent and non-violent playthroughs equally fun. They try to make the non-violent playthrough as frustrating and as inconvenient as possible, with one fun exception. So the game often offers you this choice. Like I said, stand in this line or shoot your way through this line. With one exception, in the beginning of Tuesday, you have to get a petition signed. You literally have to walk around and go up to NPCs and ask them to sign your petition. There is no violent alternative to this. You literally need to walk up to people and ask them to sign your petition. And about 2 out of every 3 people you'll go up to will curse you out and make fun of you. And the only violent thing you can do is if you hit the button numerous times to add them to sign a petition, you'll insult them. And if they're a non-police officer, they'll run away. And if they're a police officer, they'll try to arrest you. But you cannot do this violently.
I mean, once again, this says more about the person who created the game than it does about us. Because guess what? The choices you're supposed to make in this game, I make those choices every day of my life. And you know what choice I make? I choose to stand in line and wait to pay for my groceries. I stand around and get people to sign a petition. And then I go home. We all make that choice. It's fine. I'm totally fine with making that choice. It's not a reason I would play a game.
And running with scissors arguments, you're a goddamn sucker for doing that.
So that's a point that I've been waiting for, where there's an idea here that could work in theory with the right team. But this idea of you're doing something that you would do every day, but there's a violent option. Well, why not choose it? I'm waiting for what else is going on in this game. Like there's a piece I'm missing here.
So I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think all of this is in service of reminding the player that pacifism is consistently the shittier option. And you both kind of alluded to this question, Elford and Phil. But for a moment, I kind of thought maybe there's something really brilliant about this, that they're almost trying to say something really fascinating about video game violence. So you could be like you are in real life. It's like, sure, you can stand in line and buy milk like a chump, or you just say, fuck it, and mow everyone down, decapitate them with shovels, pour gasoline on them, light them on fire, piss on the ashes, all that stuff. And the game basically says, this is the way I interpret it, the gameplay says that's okay, because video game violence is not the same as real world violence, and will never will be, because the people in Paradise aren't real people. They're polygons and lines of code. And so, like, despite what the movie Free Guy would have us believe, the NPCs don't have feelings or hopes or dreams or families. So why are you even bothering to be peaceful? Like, grab a shovel or gas can and some matches and just have fun. Or did you forget that video games are supposed to be fun? And it's almost like Postal 2 conveys by design that passive in video games is for losers. So whether their intention intentionally trying to convey that kind of message in the game. I found that kind of interesting. Oh, do you want to jump in, Phil?
Well, what I think is strange is that if you're the type of person who's going to mow everybody down at the grocery store because you have to wait in line to buy milk, what the fuck are you buying milk for? Like, what are you going to do? You're going to go home and make yourself a latte with it? You're going to go home and make some French toast? You don't seem like the type of person who's going to do anything that normal people use milk for in real life.
I'll tell you what Postal Dude is using milk for, Phil. He puts a bowl on the ground, pours some milk in the bowl. A cat comes over, starts drinking the milk, and we know what he needs that cat for. I feel like you haven't been paying attention, Phil.
Outside of going to the store to get the milk, do they give the player a purpose? Is there a story, or is the only purpose to get the milk?
The extent that this game has a story, in the first game that the Postal Dude has been evicted from his house and he decides to snap. Now he's supposed to be like a browbeaten husband who has this horrible wife at home in his trailer he lives in, who is demanding that he goes out and does things. So like, go out and get your paycheck and go cash it at the bank. Use that money to go buy milk. Go get me ice cream and things like that. He's got a shitty life and a shitty marriage, and all these other things are happening around him. To the extent this game has a story, that's it.
Does the player's choices affect the storyline of the Postal Dude?
Not a goddamn thing affects this game. This game is not a BioShock. They're not playing with what happens if you're passive, as the exact same game plays out either way.
One last piece of commentary before we move on. I'm just tickled by the idea that Vince Desi is reading these press clippings about Postal 2, and then all of a sudden he gets a phone call from his wife where she asks him to pick up some milk, and then he just very demurely goes to the store and buys it and walks in with his head hanging down, because that's who he is in real life. And if he wanted outcomes to be different, he has to create a whole fantasy world that is not very entertaining for anyone else to play, for him to act out, telling his wife, you know what, I don't feel like picking up milk today.
Dude, if you told me that Vince Desi was going through a nasty divorce in this game, I would not be stunned. They're dealing with some stuff and some things, and they're putting it on the screen for everybody to play out. But going back to my point before, I said they basically make this choice between violence and non-violence, and every obstacle is thrown in the player's way if they want to do the passive option. I would be okay with that, were it not for the fact that the combat is absolute dog shit. Every enemy is a bullet sponge. The hit detection stinks. If you did a body blow versus a headshot, there's no difference. I thought this is what we figured out in GoldenEye, which came out in 1997. The enemy AI can get you behind corners and undercover, and in any situation, you're always going to take a couple of hits. And all that is on top of all this other bullshit they piled on there, like the lazy jokes and the racism and the homophobia and all that other stuff, which all that stuff is wretched too. It would not have been okay even if the combat was good. But I didn't find really anything redeeming about this game that I would have recommended for this. I do not recommend this game. However, while I didn't love Postal 2, I will tell you one audience it was quite popular with: moral conservatives. Because for politicians and moral activists, Postal 2 was an absolute godsend. It proved a handy go-to example when they argued that video game violence is out of control and needed to be kept out of the hands of children by legislation if necessary. It also helped provide evidence of why video games needed to be treated differently than other forms of media. So for example, you're saying a video game where you can decapitate a cop with a shovel, set him on fire, and piss on him to put him out deserves the same kind of protection under the law as Great Expectations. And footage of Postal 2 appeared in a lot of the state legislatures and courts where they're debating these different laws banning access to video games, and go back to our Brown v. EMA episode, for example, with a bunch of them during this time. It also made a lot of Moral Crusaders' worst games lists. So, for example, in December of 2003, it appeared on the National Institute of Media and the Family's annual list of media-wise games to avoid. There was also, on November the 23rd, 2004, a coalition of moral activist groups added Postal 2 to their own list of the most violent video games that were out there. And in fact, a callback to an old friend of ours, a month after that, it also appeared on a similar list compiled by Illinois Governor and future convicted felon Rod Blagojevich. All of this, against all odds, put Postal 2 in the same sentence as such illustrious titles as Halo 2, Doom 3, Half-Life, and Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. So way to go running with scissors, we did it. Media outlets also tried to link Postal 2 to several violent crimes. On January the 12th, 2006, 20-year-old Alexander Kopsev went on a stabbing spree in a Moscow synagogue, wounding 9 people. And reports reports of the stabbing described Kopsev as an avid gamer whose favorite game was allegedly Postal 2. And a January the 13th, 2006 report in Pravda on the attacks is a masterclass in video game alarmism, painting Kopsev as, in their words, a zombie programmed to kill by violent video games and a victim of what the writer called video game epilepsy syndrome. However, more in-depth reporting revealed that Kopsev's synagogue attack probably had less to do with Postal 2 reprogramming his brain and more to do with the fact that he was a neo-Nazi. Later that year, reports also attempted to link both Postal and Postal 2 to a September the 13th, 2006 mass shooting at Dawson College in Montreal, as well as a string of arsons in Gaston County, North Carolina in 2008.
I think the most surprising thing about all of those examples is that there's actual evidence of people having willingly played this game.
And if you're going to talk about moral conservatives reacting to a violent video game, you can't have a game announcement party without our old friend, Mr. Jack Thompson. Jack was clearly aware of the series. In fact, he even drew some inspiration from Postal 2. If you recall his modest video game proposal, which was his infamous October the 10th, 2005 open letter, where he offered a $10,000 charitable donation if a game company would develop a game in which all of his personal enemies were brutally killed. And for more on that, check out our two-part series on Jack Thompson. In one scene, Thompson described the game's protagonist storming his way into the home of Paula Eibel, who was a stand-in for then Take-Two CEO Paul Eibler, murdering her and her entire family and peeing on their exposed brain stems, quote, just as you do on the decapitated cops in the real video game Postal 2, end quote. In September 2006, Thompson was one of several moral crusaders to come out of the woodwork to blame Postal for the Montreal shooting I mentioned a minute ago, sending an email to press outlets with the subject heading, quote, Jack Thompson right again. Around this time, this is one of my favorite parts of the story, Jack Thompson also made a really interesting claim. According to Jack, in 2005, he challenged none other than Vincent J. Desiderio Jr. to a debate. And that according to Thompson, Desi allegedly turned him down. As an aside, I would legitimately pay money to see Vince Desi and Jack Thompson in a public forum yelling at each other. So if you're listening to this, Jack Thompson, Vince Desi, make it happen. Let's do it. Give the people what they want.
And then Uwe Boll challenges the winner to a boxing match, right?
Yes, I love this idea. However, I don't think Jack ever challenged Vince to a debate. And all of that has to do with the egos of both Vince Desi and Jack Thompson. On the one hand, as a general rule, Jack Thompson can never be your first source on any information because number one, he is self-serving to a fault and frequently exaggerates or overstates his role in things that directly involve him. And number two, he has a history of making shit up. On the other hand, if Thompson had challenged Desi to a debate, you cannot tell me that Vince Desi and Running with Scissors wouldn't be shouting from the rafters about it. I mean, Joe Lieberman in 1997 denounced Postal 1 as digital poison, and the company's been milking his response for the last quarter century. The easiest difficulty in Postal 2 is called Lieber mode. After the U.S. Postmaster General sent a letter to Running with Scissors discouraging them from releasing Postal, that was back in April of 1997, not only did Vince Desi frame the letter and put it in his office, when they put Running with Scissors' studio in Postal 2, I did mention that. The dudes from Running with Scissors inserted themselves in their own game. They made a digital version of Vince Desi's office, and they put the letter from the U.S. Postmaster General in his virtual office. So you cannot tell me that they wouldn't make sure everyone knew that Jack Thompson wanted to debate Vince Desi. That's what makes me think that Jack never really did this, that he just claimed he did it, because any kind of public press, the guys at Running with Scissors were jumping on. In any case, debate challenge notwithstanding, on January the 18th, 2006, following the Moscow synagogue attack, Desi published a statement directed specifically at Jack Thompson, accusing the Florida attorney of engaging in a, quote, despicable, self-serving campaign to spread misinformation and hateful invective about Running with Scissors and Postal in particular, and the entire video game industry in general, end quote. Now, going back to Running with Scissors, you might be wondering how they felt about the game's less than stellar reception. Publicly, the company tried to roll with the punches, maintaining their time-honored philosophy that any publicity is good publicity. In 2006, when the company released a compilation of Postal and Postal 2, they printed the 0 out of 10 from Computer Gaming World, as well as Robert Coffey's amazing closing sentence for the review of Postal 2 on the game's box. I told you we'd come back to that. Desi also eventually trademarked the phrase, worst game ever. However, when addressing Postal 2's fan base, Desi took on a significantly different tone. Following the goose eggs the game received from gamer and computer gaming worlds, Desi put out a letter through the Running with Scissors mailing list that I can only describe as a massive shit fit, railing against the game's negative reception in positively Trumpian terms. Quote, only because I'm being swamped with emails telling me about some a-hole journalist imposters at Computer Gaming World and Gamer magazines do I feel compelled to write to you, the greatest fans in the world, greatest fans is in all caps. It is you and only you who we care about. I've just returned from a rare vacation and have learned of the perfect score, 0, that we received from some thesaurus-smoking rape clown writer at CGW and an identical twin turd at Gamer. Now 2 zeros plus 2 a-holes equals pure crap. Pure crap's in all caps. These guys have their tongues firmly implanted in the anuses of their sterile parent game publisher, Ziff Davis. Ziff Davis owned Gamer and Computer Gaming World at the time. Now, I don't mind that they use Running with Scissors or Postal to grab attention to their failing tampon of a rag magazine, but it's a real disservice to mislead their subscribers, gamers, and everyone in the gaming community. People pay hard-earned money for their magazines, and they look for accurate information and reviews about games, not political expressions by closet case pseudo-journalists. My apologies to all who have paid for these moralistic manifestos. One can only suspect that they're on the payroll of the Lieberman for President campaign. So much for independence and originality. God bless America. We sure can use it. So I say to you, to hell with them. Let's not waste our valuable time stretching these a-holes. Let's move on and have fun, play Postal, destroy, kill, and enjoy life. Always V. Thoughts?
I guess there was more wrong in America than Gary Coleman.
You know, his statement really does read just like he's some sort of fringe politician trying to rally his base versus a video game developer. Because one of the beautiful things about video games is the court of opinion is based on the gamers for real, not really based on like perceptions that gamers are given by reviews or talking heads, but what actually gamers actually are going to do with their time. It's very different than a lot of the other things people think they have opinions of. Like there are many people who walk around and say, I like this game, but they only play it for 2 hours and never think about it again. And all this data is being kept nowadays and recorded, and you can see just what games people actually want to play. And so if Postal didn't sell, it's because Postal wasn't very good, but he's pitching it as if this is like some sort of political action that's going on.
Elford, something you said really struck a chord with me. Based on his response, it seems like those negative reviews hit a real nerve with him. And he telegraphs that the only reason these reviewers would put something so hurtful out there is because they're clearly trying to draw attention to themselves. And there's no actual merit behind the thing they put out there. That's the first thing he thinks. Why do you think that was the first conclusion he jumped to?
Yeah, and I also think, like, in his letter, it seemed like he was only taking issue with people's criticism of the messaging in the game. He did not at all really dispute, like, the combat is bad. The loading times are too, like, he himself was also only looking at this game as this political, artistic expression and not as a game. And yet then he can't take the criticism of people responding to it on that level of...
Yeah, it seems interesting that he's so triggered by that. Yeah.
They hit him where it hurts. He's clearly trolling, but this game is filth. But the reason you shouldn't play it is because it's not fun, right? That's why you shouldn't play it. It's a waste of time because it's not fun to play. And we don't actually need to protest this game because no one will actually play this game because it's not fun.
During your time, did you feel like there was an overlying story to the game?
No.
Did you feel like there was any character development?
No.
This story could be completely different if they had done several basic things that other games at the time were doing, such as simply writing a story that was going to be interesting for most people. You can make your character crass, like Duke Nukem was crass. You can make your character have these sort of leanings, and just some people are going to not be interested in his wanting to use racial slurs and sexist. Some people are not going to be interested in that. But if they had made the game have some sort of story, made the combat fun and interesting, and made the choice to do things violently versus what they're calling pacifistly. I would call it normally, because they're not really putting me in a situation to be a passive. They're just putting me in a situation to do some things normally. If they would have made that choice interesting, like for instance, I think you referred to BioShock already, and BioShock does a very good job of capturing the morality of your choices in the game. If you are unaware up front, you don't know what the outcome of your choices are going to be till the end. Where this game is trying to up front say that you're making these moral choices when you're really not. If the choice is steal the milk or spend hours running around town looking for dollar bills so that you can buy it, that's ridiculous. Nobody's going to want to do that.
Their whole thing is that games are only supposed to be fun and only supposed to be entertaining. Like, I would see them as thinking the story is not terribly important.
I mean, I think probably can think of a game that we like that either doesn't have a story or doesn't have much story. But for a game that clearly is setting out to have such a strong identity to then not have a story, I think, like Elford, you brought up Duke Nukem. I feel like that's a really apt comparison because I think they were really thinking that, oh, Postal Dude is like Duke Nukem. He'll make these little quips and the audience will think, oh, this guy is cool. I do not think they succeeded.
What I think is weird about this game is that it's one of the only games I've ever seen where you have to share a worldview that the creator of the game also has in order to be able to engage with it. Like, the reason a lot of video games don't have real storylines is because the actual gameplay is fun, and coming up with an elaborate story is kind of getting in the way of that. But this one, you kind of have to share the view that people who are not there to expedite your quality of life deserve to be killed with impunity. Like, you have to share that in order to be able to engage with this game. And quite frankly, I don't know of any other games that make an assumption like that up front.
I think what you guys are saying is exactly it. This game is defining itself by its statements. Unlike a game like some of our really popular modern shooters, which are defining themselves mostly by the technical advancements they're making and how easy to get into multiplayer and how advanced. So people are building their own stories by having their teams of real people that meet up online and playing the games together. And they don't need an elaborate story. Most of them have a single player that you could play through, but most people aren't buying it for that. And you have lots of games that don't have story. But when these guys pitch these ideas that are about, okay, there's people that need to know the real truth and this is how the world is, then I start looking for story. And when I don't find anything, I feel very empty because there isn't the other aspects of gameplay that are necessary for a good video game that would allow a video game that's storyless. And it's layered on top is the bunch of crap that you're telling me, right? Which in Duke Nukem, he never goes this far, but he does do a lot of sexual humor and a lot of stupid teenage sort of humor that, you might chuckle at because you couldn't believe he said that. But the game was fun to play. Like Wolfenstein or Doom, it was fun to play the game. Whereas this looks really, really lame. And they try ideas, but Grand Theft Auto 3 was amazing. And if they're copying it, they left out some of those aspects that Grand Theft Auto 3 and its follow-ups did do, and they're not doing. And it's really hard to tell a story that all people are going to approach and appreciate. So if you want to do something niche like this, where your story is supposed to capture this segment of a population, and you're going to say that it's maybe 25%, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 50%, then you're going to need even better writing to try to draw even those people into your story. Because here you have a story. There's a man who is having a bad life and he's with a partner who's not very kind to them. Okay, in 7 days, what's going to happen with this character? Because that's actually what this game is. This game is not about gameplay. They don't put any effort into it. So they just fail to get it. A good example of a game that doesn't go wild with story is the Souls series. It's like you can play through the game and barely know the story, but then you can go back and you can dig if you're interested and learn that there's this storyline going on that you're actually participating in. And furthermore, the way you play those games is the story. The story itself is directly related to that. So, what happens to a human being who goes to a convenience store and pulls out a machine gun and starts shooting it, right?
I think that's really insightful, Alfred. I mean, what I would add to that is that it's telling that the creator of this game doesn't feel it's necessary to explain that worldview. Like, he's making an assumption that all of these things should be obvious and natural. It should be obvious to you that the game player that you go into a store and you get frustrated that everyone's not white. You know, why can't I steal this with a bandit? Why is a woman trying to talk to me? I mean, obviously I should be able to kill with impunity at that. Like, none of that stuff is explained because they're making an assumption that that type of feeling should be an obvious and popular opinion.
I think on a certain level, Running with Scissors knew their games were going to get lambasted by critics. For example, during the April 10, 2003 press release, right before Postal 2 came out, Running with Scissors declared, quote, "We made Postal 2 for our fans, not for politicians, parents, or penis-challenged critics," end quote. Now, with all of that in mind, you're the head of Running with Scissors. You just put out a game that got a pretty poor critical reception and a mixed reception at best from gamers. What do you do next? Do you A, ignore your critics, just keep going? B, use the negative reviews as motivation to drive you toward new and original ideas with the thought that you'll win the critics over in the long run? Or C, aggressively try to discredit anyone who is critical of you?
I say B.
See?
Yeah, I feel like C is very much the philosophy espoused by the game itself.
Now, longtime listeners will know that whenever I offer the three options, the answer is always C. And if you select the C, then congratulations, you're Vince Desi. Because for the next several years, Desi and other members of Running with Scissors went out of their way to discredit and delegitimize anyone who gave Postal 2 a bad review. This tactic coalesced into two narratives from the company. The first is that people who reviewed Postal 2 negatively never actually played the game. For example, in a 2006 Gama Sutra interview, Desi observed, quote, "The only thing that still drives me nuts is when a critic or reviewer actually tells me they haven't played Postal or even seen it, and they go on to write a negative or misleading story or uneducated review," end quote. In a 2010 GamePro article, Postal 2 producer Mike Jarrett presented an account of IGN's review of Postal 2 that sounds so provably false, I'm amazing he wasn't sued for slander. Quote, "IGN was one of the first websites post review of Postal 2. Their review went up 2 hours after their package was delivered. You can read the review yourself. It was very obvious the guy didn't even play it. The reviewer played the game and wrote the entire story in 2 hours. I'm not saying you should like every game. There's a lot of terrible games out there, but if you're going to hate something right out of the box, you shouldn't be reviewing games. A lot of work goes into games and everybody should be given their fair trial," end quote.
I feel like the subtext there is he's saying, like, look, the load times in this game are so long. I know he wouldn't even have had time to start this in 2 hours.
When asked for comment, Ivan Sulik, who wrote the 5.5 out of 10 review for IGN, explained he received his review code for Postal 2 days in advance, and he had put in between 20 and 30 hours, and my hat is off to him. And I've read his review. It pretty much reflects the stuff I've said to you about my experience in this game. He totally played this game. So Mike J is absolutely lying here. But you know what? Not everyone hated Postal 2. And for evidence of a positive review, I want to call attention to a fascinating one I came across while perusing the GameFAQs user reviews. Posted on December the 30th, 2003 by someone calling themselves Rogie, the review gave the game a 9 out of 10. I call attention to this review in particular because while I cannot definitively prove this, I strongly believe it was written by someone with Running with Scissors, if not Vince Desi himself. Rogie praised the game across the board, with the loading times being the only slight knock against it. But the majority of this review reads as a response to Postal 2's negative critical reviews, with the writer going out of their way to explain that the game is actually well designed and that the game's absurdist humor is what makes its humor so effective. Also emphasizing that Running with Scissors were definitely not just trying to use controversy to sell a game. At one point saying, quote, "In terms of the gameplay, it is clever and well thought out. The level design is good and pleasing to the eye. The weapons range from urination to rotting cowheads to a cat used as a silencer. Again, this is over-the-top humor. The game does not make you want to go out to do this stuff because it is obviously absurd, thus the humor. Get it, people? End quote. And that was actually another argument that they would make a lot in the public, is saying that, like, our games are not that bad because people are obviously aren't going to go do this in real life. So that's actually another talking point of Running with Scissors, to say something like that. Also, as with Running with Scissors, Rogi also suspected that critics who reviewed the game poorly didn't actually play it, saying, quote, "It is obvious to me that the MAG reviewers did not play this game at length, for if they had, they would have been quite amused," end quote. Aside from all of this, the thing that stands out to me as possible evidence that someone at Running with Scissors wrote this is the title they chose for this review. Rogi chose the title of the review, quote, "Over-the-top Pulp Fiction style humor and gameplay," end quote. Listeners of our previous episode on Postal will note that Running with Scissors likes to compare their games to Pulp Fiction. For example, a March the 20th, 1997 press release for the original Postal declared, quote, "This game theoretically represents as much of a shock to the software entertainment system as Pulp Fiction did for the world of cinema," end quote. So like I said, I cannot definitively prove that a Running with Scissors person wrote this, but I think someone at the company wrote this review. So the first narrative is that people who gave it bad reviews obviously never played it. The second narrative presented by Running with Scissors is that publications that negatively review the games are actively conspiring against them. A frequent litany from the company is that tons of critics really think their games are hilarious, but their mean old editors and corporate overlords force them to give Postal 2 bad reviews. As Desi explained in a 2010 interview with Patrick Shaw of GamePro, quote, "I'll give you an example of something that happened after Postal 2 came out. A review site was going to give it an 8.5. A day later, we got a call from the reviewer who said, 'Look, I'm really sorry, but my editor won't allow me to give you a rating more than a 2. Do you want me to scratch the whole story?' I told them no, go ahead and run it," end quote. Now, I'm not calling Desi a liar, but as far as I know, no one has ever come forward to back up these kinds of claims. Now, why editors would want to deliberately tank Postal 2? Well, that's obvious. The game is too extreme and Running with Scissors are too courageous, telling the jokes that the liberals can't handle, so the powers that be have to actively try to silence them. In fact, when later asked about Postal 2's bad Metascore, Desi explained in a 2014 Reddit AMA, quote, "I know for a fact that several times reviewers loved Postal, but their editors wouldn't allow a high score. Political correctness, what we're up against," end quote. So there you go. It's not that you made a deliberately gross, racist game with shitty hit detection and abysmally long load times. It's that those mean old editors at IGN and GameSpot and whoever, with their political correctness, don't want to give your shitty game a fair shake.
Yeah, I think the evidence you laid out pretty much speaks for itself and is also in keeping with the original Postal.
I mean, I kind of see the point that, first they came for the games where you can pee on people. Then they came for the games where you can use a cat as a silencer. And then they came for the games where you can behead cops with a shovel. And then when they came for me, there were no other games by Running with Scissors left to defend me.
Yeah.
Let's fast forward a few years. So for the rest of the 2000s and the early 2010s, Running with Scissors found itself working hard to prop up their flagship product as it teetered toward irrelevancy. On June the 25th, 2003, Running with Scissors declared victory in its trademark battle with the U.S. Postal Service. And for more on that, check out our previous episode on Postal. Not soon after, on July the 10th, 2003, the company announced a contest where the person who sent the most extreme Postal 2 screenshot could win a party with the dudes at Running with Scissors and the ability to take part in a nude photo shoot with the Postal Babes, which was supposedly going out for a 2004 calendar.
Wait, so who was going to be nude in the photo shoot?
Allegedly the Postal Babes. However, I have no evidence this contest ever happened. I think they just put this out there as a hoax to get a little bit of extra attention for shock value, which is not uncharacteristic of Running with Scissors from what we've seen so far. During the summer of 2003, when gameplay footage briefly appeared in the music video for the Black Eyed Peas song Where Is the Love, Running with Scissors put out a press release with Desi doing an absolutely cringe-worthy attempt at a Snoop Dogg impression. I'm way too white to read this, but I will leave it in the notes if people want to read it on our website, scandalousgamingspodcast.wordpress.com. They also optioned the game into a movie. In October 2005, Running with Scissors announced the movie rights had been picked up by none other than our old friend, Dr. Uwe Boll.
No way.
The pairing of Uwe Boll and Vince Desi is a match made in heaven. Uwe Boll, his common litany is that people who give his movies bad reviews never actually watch them, and that people are being deliberately mean to drum him out of the business. So I could see him and Desi having a lot in common. Bull's Postal movie premiered in 2008 on a paltry 6 screens worldwide, and it earned less than $150,000 on a $10 to $15 million budget. Yeah, not good. Not good. Bull,
You gotta be fucking kidding me.
Bull blamed the movie's failure on political correctness. It had nothing to do with the fact that at that point, people realized he was box office poison, and the number of movie theaters willing to pick up his movies had been declining precipitously at that time.
Can all these guys just get a fucking room already? Vince Desi, Uwe Boll, Jack Thompson, anybody who believes in me is smart. Anyone who criticizes me doesn't know what they're talking about and is lying.
Oh yeah, I should point out that occasionally it did game-making things too. In December 2003, they released Share the Pain, which was a Postal 2 expansion that had multiplayer and fixed some of the technical issues, including smoothing out some of the game's horrendous load times. I should also point out that by the time Share the Pain came out, Whiptail had parted ways with Running with Scissors for unspecified reasons. So if you're keeping score at home, this means that Running with Scissors had 2 game releases and lost 2 publishers in the process. Also, despite their kvetching about critics being unfair to them, it did gain a more positive reception. For example, when reviewing Share the Pain, GameSpot bumped up the game's initial 4 out of 10 to a decent 6.2 out of 10. In 2005, they put out another expansion, Apocalypse Weekend, that added 2 more levels, Saturday and Sunday. They also stayed pretty active with the game's modder community, even bundling 2 fan creations in their 2006 compilation of Postal and Postal 2. Running with Scissors also had a brief but disastrous stint as a publisher, possibly reasoning that you can't get dropped by your publisher if you're the one publishing the game, right? In 2006, they announced Postal 3. This time, they outsourced the game to a Russian company called Arkela. The game went through a rough production, to say the least. It didn't come out till 2011, and when it came out, even longtime Postal fans hated it. It wasn't because of the game's humor, because all it did was get more crass and more racist and more gross, but apparently it was also even more technically broken than Postal 2. And so even the people who agreed with all that humor before also thought this was a shitty game. And in fact, it got so bad, Running with Scissors pulled the game from their online store in 2012, and as of this recording, have completely disavowed it. They actually on their website actively discourage people from buying it. So yeah, not so great for Postal 3.
Kevin, it's funny that they felt the need to release a multiplayer expansion to Postal 2 because there's another way you can play this multiplayer. It's called grocery shopping. You go into a store. It has other players, also known as people, in it. You choose things to buy and you get in line with them and you decide whether or not you want to be a productive member of society. And the way to win that game is to choose yes.
What's the peeing options like in that game?
No, don't do that.
I'm glad we're laughing now because this is going to take a slightly dark turn. Despite some rough years, Running with Scissors' fortunes took a sudden turn for the better in 2014, and it was all thanks to Gamergate. Now, the entire sordid, emotionally exhausting history of Gamergate will be its own episode. So I'm going to give you the absolute short version. In 2014, an angry subset of the gaming community organized an online movement. Their basic push was what they called for quote-unquote ethics in games journalism, while alleging various conflicts of interest among members of the mainstream gaming press. That's in theory. In practice, this largely translated into peddling various conspiracy theories, railing against any form of video game criticism, and denouncing any efforts to make gaming as a medium or a business more conducive to communities that weren't straight cisgender white dudes. Incidentally, its tactics also relied heavily on harassing people perceived as their enemies, many of whom just happened to be marginalized people in the gaming community. Funny how that worked out. Gamergate advocates argued in part that video games were for entertainment and should only be examined on their technical merits. So the game critics should focus specifically on graphics, controls, level design, entertainment value. That's what games specifically are for. They're entertainment pieces. And that any attempts to critically examine video games beyond that, for example, addressing representation in games, such as the roles of, say, women or people of color, or again, pretty much any character depiction that isn't a straight white dude, or, like any form of analysis analysis of the social, cultural, or political messages of video games are just social justice warriors, or SJWs, inserting their own politics into video games. Thus, the real gamers, and of course, the Gamergaters view themselves as the real gamers, need to stand up for the medium that they love against these outside agitators. Of course, because SJWs and these mainstream journalists and any other critics are not real gamers. They're just trying to tear down this medium we like, and we need to defend video gaming by any means necessary. And you know what? All that was pretty sweet for Running with Scissors, considering they've been peddling conspiracy theories and demonizing game journalists who were mean to them since before it was cool. So it should come as no shock then that they are one of the only video game companies to come out in support of Gamergate. On October the 8th, 2014, Running with Scissors published a statement on the company Tumblr page simply titled #Gamergate. Most of it is a tirade against game journalists, whom Running with Scissors called, quote, dishonest favor seekers, money grubbers, liars, and cheats, end quote, and accused of various nefarious acts, including bribery, corruption, and, quote, denouncing, shaming, and outright insulting their own audience, end quote. They accused journalists and academics of imposing their values on the quote unquote real gamers and trying to completely erase the gamer identity. Because you see, Running with Scissors are the real gamers, and they're denouncing all these fake gamers and these outside agitators, mainstream journalists and social justice warriors who are sullying the purity of our gaming medium. Gamergate was a golden opportunity for Running with Scissors. It gave them access to a vocal niche market that had no problem with Postal's content, and in fact celebrated that kind of content, and who, like them, were actively hostile of critics and journalists. Any negative criticism of the series could then be called into question. Clearly, if you didn't like the game, you obviously didn't play it, or you're trying to push some kind of liberal agenda. Bad press then is either symbolic of the business interests that control mainstream gaming news sites, or critics are trying to impose political correctness and silence any game that doesn't fit into their worldview. Positive press, meanwhile, reinforces just how awesome these games are, and that Running with Scissors is, they're telling it like it is, regardless of what the woke PC police say. Thus, Gamergate allowed Running with Scissors to reshape Postal 2 from a mediocre shooter into an act of defiance, a liberty bond in the war on political correctness. Every dollar, every download, every minute of your game playing time is your own personal fuck you to the so-called game journalists and SJWs and libtards who want to trample on your freedom to, I guess, endure long load times and shitty hit detection and jokes about how all Muslims are terrorists. Traipse it across that map to own the libs, So despite their public aversion to politics in video games, Running with Scissors, thanks to Gamergate, helped transform buying and playing Postal 2 into a political act. In this respect, Postal 2, going back to our opening, may just be the first MAGA game. It weaponized a segment of the gaming community, resentful and angry at mainstream institutions such as the press, academics, liberals, and anyone who didn't fit into their narrow model of gamer, framing their outrage and their harassment tactics as their crusade to protect the sanctity and purity of their pastime from the outside agitators and fake gamers of the world. Think again how Desi pronounced Gamer and Computer Game Review as failing publications, dumping on his perfect game to prop up their reputations and push an agenda. And I think with this, it's also worth mentioning that the game has gained a popularity in the MAGA crowds and the alt-right. For example, former Breitbart editor Milo Yiannopoulos praised the game, and Running with Scissors even had him voice himself in the 2015 Postal 2 expansion Paradise Lost. So this is where we're at now.
Yeah, it seems like that's a compelling parallel to draw because it seems like people are supporting it who have probably never played it. It's clearly not because you enjoyed playing it, but because of the views that it espouses.
Kevin, I got to congratulate you on this detective work and linking these two issues together, because I entered this understanding of Postal not assuming that there was a relationship, and showing that they have actually started to merge. It's very interesting because sadly for the people that will buy Postal 2 to make a political statement, I don't care what they play. If your experience tells you Postal 2 is a great game to play, go ahead and spend 30 hours playing it. I'm not going to do it. People have a deep understanding of what is good art. Even though we can't express it, we know. And so Sure, you want to pitch Postal 2 and use that as your political ad for your ideas and your politics? Great, but I say Grand Theft Auto did the same thing, except they did it well. You could go through Grand Theft Auto and you could pull your gun out and you could shoot somebody. That's all Postal 2 was. In Grand Theft Auto, you always had that choice. And that's something that people recognized immediately with Grand Theft Auto 3. But that wasn't all there was to the game. The game was fun to play. You can transition to a car. You can drive around this really neat city. You're inside of this really neat world. And Running with Scissors, they just didn't do a good enough job.
I feel like linking this to the MAGA movement does make perfect sense. And like what Phil and Elford were saying about how people who embrace this game now are doing it for the statement of what that means rather than a game that you actually like. It just reminds me of I'm going to take horse dewormer to own the libs. I'm going to burn my Nikes that I paid for to own the libs. I mean, things that are making a statement without you benefiting or even enjoying the process of making that statement, which it sounds like playing this game exactly is. You're doing something maybe to make a statement without enjoying a moment of it.
I mean, Andy, I will say for the record that taking ivermectin did clear up my constipation. So there was some benefit.
Well, I think what cleared up your constipation was when I stuck that gun up your butt and used you as a silencer. The ivermectin was just incidental.
I'm glad you guys are talking solutions because I'm all bound up. I can use something to cleanse me out.
For the record, I didn't actually take ivermectin. I have no thoughts on it.
All of this to say that Postal 2 gained a second life as an idea rather than a game. Something praised and defended, but not necessarily played. This could actually be seen in the player statistics for this game. So for example, the game has over 54,000 reviews on Steam, and most of them are overwhelmingly positive. However, you got to look a little bit deeper in the data because the other thing that Steam keeps track of is achievements. And achievement statistic tracking is a really good way of measuring how far people are going into games and how long they're staying with them. Based on Steam achievements, 47.8% have unlocked the achievement for finishing the first level. Less than half of players make it through the first level of this game. Now, knowing that statistic, guess what the percentage of players who actually finish all 5 days is?
5%.
10%?
3%.
16.3% of players.
What?
Actually,
a lot higher than I thought.
It's not super high, but it's kind of surprisingly higher than you think it should be. That being said, I mentioned Paradise Lost briefly before the 2015 expansion. The percentage of players who have the achievement for finishing that game, 4.5%. So yeah, not a lot of people playing this game for very long. And so all of that is to say that Postal 2 is one of those games that has become more useful as an idea, even for the company that created it. And so that's pretty much where Running with Scissors and its flagship title have stayed ever since. Fast forward to the present day, and Postal 2 does have a cult following, although how many people are playing it to the end is something we've addressed. Thanks to digital distribution and a decentralized games market, Running with Scissors can specifically target their small but vocal fan base without having to pretend to care about retailers, publishers, negative critical reviews, or anything close to broad market appeal. They've got the niche. Basically, if you're angry about cancel culture run amok, feel white men are the real ones being oppressed, that women and people of color and gay people should stop whining about oppression, and that wokeness and political correctness are real, tangible threats, then Running with Scissors is a game for you. The flip side is that it's pretty much the only market where they're relevant. And Running with Scissors then needs to wring every last penny they can out of these people, because outside of this niche, nobody's paying attention to them. This has created a kind of amusing scenario where the only way they can stay in business is to grift gamergaters. For example, on October the 14th, 2019, Running with Scissors released the long-anticipated sequel, Postal 4 No Regrets, as a crude alpha build through Steam's early access. And over the last 2 years, going on 3, the company has been drip-feeding updates to this game with a new buggy early build of a level every couple of months. The Friday level only dropped on November the 22nd, 2021. Do you want to guess how much they're charging people for the privilege of playing a game that is way far away from being finished?
Is this like a full price, like $60 experience?
I'm thinking like $20.
I think if they're hard up for cash, they might charge something like $100.
$40.
That's pretty steep.
They also have the gall to sell a physical copy of this game, which is called the Coming Early Janky Edition, which they are also selling for $40 on their website.
I mean, at this point, you can't even blame them. They're saying, we're selling you a janky version of a game. Whoever's paying it is just like willingly buying into the statement that having this game says.
All of that might sound pretty cynical, but don't worry. No one can accuse Vince Desi of being insincere to his fan base. For proof he's on their side, I direct you to his social media, especially his Twitter, which is a hellscape of COVID-19 conspiracies, cries of election fraud, and other Tucker Carlson / Ben Shapiro / Alex Jones / Let's Go Brandon style far-right bullshit. If you told me he stormed the Capitol on January 6th, I would not be shocked.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Final thoughts on Postal 2.
Something I realized is that I could create a video game like this as a Trojan horse to start collecting personally identifying information on people who are likely to storm the Capitol again. This game is such a red flag for a certain subset of people that I want to see the Venn diagram of people who platted Postal 2 and people who went to the Capitol on January 6th. I would venture to guess it looks like a circle.
Yeah, and just set up a bot that just, anybody who does complete the game, just those names automatically just get sent to the FBI.
This was a really cool story. You start out with this company that makes this game that obviously is trying to tell what they believe is the real person's story, but they don't tell a story. They just make a really crappy game. And then fast forward 10 plus years, and now they're just making their profit off of feeding these fringe mentalities rather than making good video games. It's actually fascinating. I can't imagine that they're making nearly as much money as if they had created a good video game, but they have some sort of profit scheme. And what they're doing now, releasing this alpha build and charging people money and people purchasing it as a badge of being part of a certain club. It's fascinating to me. The video game itself is no longer the product they're creating. The product they're creating is the emotions and the sentiment tied to the feelings that whoever they believe is the audience are supposed to have. It's interesting to me.
Yeah, and it's this game being adopted by the MAGA community is just such a striking parallel because the MAGA community originally rallied around someone who was never successful in their chosen field, but created a brand about what they stand for. And I mean, it really is like a one for one. So yeah, everybody don't be like Kevin and play this game.
Well, I mean, the joke is on me because Running with Sisters has $2 of my dollars and several hours of my time. So my final point is that these guys have accomplished something rather extraordinary. These guys haven't released a full game. I'm not counting Postal 4 because God knows when they're ever going to be finished with that. They haven't released a full game since 2003. They haven't released any meaningful content since 2015. And yet they've been able to capture the small cult. I mean, think about like FromSoft. From Software has a really, really dedicated following of gamers. There are people who absolutely love FromSoft. And to do that, they had to make a succession of consistently fun, exciting, well-developed games over the course of several years to earn that reputation.
Yeah, they release a banger every 2 years, right?
Yeah, they're awesome. They knock it out of the park every time. If they were smart, these chumps would have spent all this time complaining about cancel culture in between re-releasing Kingsfield every couple of years. I'm kind of impressed by that.
I would agree. I mean, to that point, hey, if you don't have to turn a profit to keep existing, I guess anything is possible.
Yeah, it's like they've somehow developed a post-capitalist game company where most companies run on the fact that we need to make money and people demand a product and we supply that product. They're not supplying any product, and yet somehow they're still here.
I have a radical theory of how they're still in business. They're consistently getting blackmail money. And I think the clue was buried in one of the central core mechanics of Postal 2, the ability to urinate. Who do we know who's famous for having a lot of money and also famous for not wanting anybody to think there's a videotape of him being urinated on? So,
that's great, but we're going to get in so much trouble.
Oh my God.
Like all the things that have been said about this game, it's the first post-capitalist game. It's the first MAGA game. The story involves Rod Blagojevich, Jack Thompson, and Vince Desi. What more could you ask for?
Again, debate, Jack, Vince, come on, make this happen. And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating on iTunes. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seek Me by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or an idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Elford Stephens.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Phil Thomas.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next Scandal.